Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 101. Today's guest is Rakesh Satyal. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show, and Happy New Year. I hope the holidays have brought you some joy, some rest, and some good books and good art. I'm excited to kick off 2020 with this conversation with writer Rakesh Satyal. Rakesh Satyal is a senior editor at Atria Books, a division of Simon & Schuster. He held previous positions at Doubleday and HarperCollins and spent 3 years working as a naming specialist in the world of branding. He has sat on the advisory board for the annual Penn World Voices Festival and has taught in the publishing program at New York University. He is the author of the novels Blue Boy and No One Can Pronounce My Name. I picked up Rakesh's book, No One Can Pronounce My Name, after seeing Celeste Ng tweet about it a while back. If I recall correctly, she called it a pure delight, and that turned out to be so true. Reading this book just made me so happy. The book follows three main characters. The first is Harit, a lonely, middle-aged Indian immigrant who lives with his mother, both of whom are struggling with grief after the death of Harit's sister. Then there is Ranjana, also a middle-aged Indian immigrant who suspects that her husband is having an affair and who has taken up writing as a hobby after her son has gone off to college. And then there's her son Prashant, who is trying to figure out his identity now that he's at school. Now, that setup doesn't sound like the beginning of a pure delight, but what's great about this book, and you'll hear us talk about this, is how the story continually subverts our expectations. It's just wonderful. And I highly recommend it. So do check out the link in the show notes to where you can pick up your own copy. There's so much more, but that's what you're about to hear. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Rakesh Satyal. Before I say anything else, I wanted to say I really enjoyed this book so much. It just made me so happy when I was reading this book. I just reread it again last night. To prep for this, and it was just as good the second time.
That's incredible. Thank you. That's very nice to hear.
You know, one of the things that I was thinking a lot about this book is that, you know, I heard about this book because Celeste Ng tweeted about it a while ago, and I just sort of put it on my list, and then, you know, it was a little while before I got to it. But when I first started reading it, especially the first 2 chapters, I kind of had this idea what kind of book it was going to be. And it turned out that I was completely wrong in the best kind of way. The book really sort of set up this expectation for me of like what kind of story it was going to be. I feel like especially in those first 2 chapters we're presented with scenarios with Harit and Ranjana that they are very... It's setting up a story that could be a kind of a downer, you know, kind of heavy. And then it turns out not to be that in the most like delightful and beautiful way. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit because it seems like that's important to the story.
Absolutely. I mean, you're very right to pick up on that because so much of what it's engaging with is expected notions of what people think, you know, immigrant narratives are supposed to be. And one of the things I've talked about often is that a central organizing principle often for people's expectations, at least for what the category is able to hold, are built around a grief narrative. You know, so the idea that it's that sadness and gravity and being really kind of wistful are the centerpieces of the genre, and the fact that if they don't necessarily begin that way, they have to end that way, or at least the most important element of them has to be that sadness, because the struggle of it is romanticized so much by people and almost fetishized in a way. And so you're very right that it was very intentional to begin almost with that grief narrative and then to twist it so that it was not the central focus of it as it progresses, and that in fact the humanity of it is the thing that makes it hopefully more readable and more memorable.
I mean, I think it's interesting. This is something that I think a lot about, especially when I think about like when we as artists of color or artists who are either immigrants or have immigrant families, things like that, when we make our work, who are we talking to, kind of, you know? And
right.
I feel like there's always these sort of twin things that certainly this is true in my own work, and a lot of the people I've talked to, it's been true for them as well, where on the one hand, there is this sort of expectation, as you're saying, that we don't necessarily want to play into the stereotype or whatever. And so there can be this sort of desire to sort of break free of that or subvert that, present a different narrative than maybe what's expected. At the same time, oftentimes these stereotypes come about because they have some sort of grain of truth to them, or that they're common, that there is that thing. So I'm always torn a lot between, like, there are aspects of maybe my experience or my family's experience that are very meaningful to me and that I might want to put in a story. But then sometimes I worry is like, what, like, am I playing to the stereotype?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
And how does that work? Is that something that you were thinking about in this book?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, just because you're very right to point that out, that just because these things are subjects that are common, it means that they're going to recur, and it doesn't mean that you have to ignore them or that you even have to fully minimize them. But you also, a word I use a lot in both editing and writing is calibration or recalibration. So the idea that you can take those existing elements and those topics that come up frequently and recalibrate what focus they have and what prominence they have in the larger narrative that you're trying to tell. And so I think considering, like you're saying, some of these heavier things or the struggle of it or the challenges of it, it's not like that you absent them entirely, but that you include them in a way that hopefully is somewhat different, and that you refocus people's vision on something that hasn't been uncovered, or that uncovers some level of compassion or gratitude or happiness. These other things that are often recalibrated out of the conversation, if that makes any sense, because they're not given the weight that sometimes you feel they should have.
Yeah. Sort of talking about audience again, like another thing I was thinking about, and this was especially on the reread that I noticed this. The perspective is very close with the main point of view characters. And especially with Harriet and Ranjana, they think about things and they talk about things using a lot of like sort of cultural references to Indian culture. Right. That are just like never actually explained. The thing that, like NPR's Code Switch, I don't know if you ever listened to that. They call it the explanatory comma.
Yep.
And that seemed to be almost entirely absent from this book. Like they'll think about things, and sometimes they'll even speak in, I'm not sure exactly what language it is, because it's not
Hindi,
one that
probably. Yeah.
Right. It's not one that I speak. Sometimes they'll be talking to another character and there'll be a whole sentence that's in that language. And to me, that was not a hindrance in connecting with these characters. And I thought that was a really interesting experience for me. It seemed like that must be very intentional, because usually there is an expectation that if you're going to put something that's not like real mainstream American, that you're going to explain it, right?
Absolutely. So it's all about perspective, because the thing is especially if you're looking at close third person, what you're trying to do is use that perspective in the language that then befits it to make it as accurate as possible. And so if you're going to do those kind of positive things, if you're going to provide those details, then you either have to do it in a way that you feel at least is new and fresh, so that you're not reinforcing the same language or stereotypes. Or if it's going to do those things, then it needs to be from the perspective of a character who actually sees the world that way. So, for example, like if it's something where you're creating a character who's American, who doesn't know these things, then their cultural references are probably going to be more orthodox than if you're talking about somebody, like you're saying, who's within that community and that perspective and who has a different reference point for those things. And so that's the thing that makes creating anything really fun and exciting sometimes, because it tests you in a way. It's like solving a puzzle to figure out what you're going to tailor about your own linguistic way of seeing the world to make it from that person's perspective.
It seemed to me that, so much of this book is fundamentally about connection, right? That you're starting off with all these characters who are in one way or another isolated. And by the end of the book, they have formed all of these connections with each other. And a lot of that is across a difference of some sort or another. And that might be a cultural difference, but it might be a gender difference or a sexuality difference, or just like because they're two individual people, And I feel like the reader has the same kind of experience, right? And to me, it was a really interesting and meaningful experience to be able to have that connection with these characters, even though I didn't always know exactly what their sort of touch points were, like they would be talking about things that I didn't really understand every detail of what they were talking about, but that didn't stop me from being able to connect with them. To me, that seemed like, well, for one thing, it had to be very skillfully done, but also I feel like that's an experience that marginalized people have to like try and figure out what other people are talking about.
Yeah. Right.
So maybe for me as an Asian American, it wasn't a totally foreign experience, but it seemed like a really valuable one,
Well, I appreciate, that is very much the intent of it, is to, like you're saying, take people who are coming from underrepresented backgrounds or narratives and give them agency in that way. And I think, what language allows you to do is it allows you to build that story around them. And it's kind of like triangulating an experience. It's like triangulating it among the larger narrative that you're telling, the people that you've created, and then the language you're using to put together the people in that narrative, So those things are working in tandem to actually provide that perspective. And you're right, like even if it doesn't mean that there's full comprehension of the exact detail, there's at least an emotional response that's being elicited, and that there's a kind of mental response that happens in reaction to that, that feels true, or that at least shifts the perspective somewhat and makes it more open.
Yeah. I do kind of wonder, like I mentioned, I'm Asian American. And so like, having to sort of understand other people's experiences is something as, at least I'm marginalized in that one way. So that's sort of a familiar experience for me. But I kind of wonder if like, a white American audience might have a different experience of that, reading experience. But, and like, so I was just sort of curious, like, do you get like radically different responses depending on sort of the who the reader is,
The truth is, and I don't want to sound like this is too tidy of an answer, but I think I don't necessarily. I think people generally, readers have a pretty high threshold of understanding, I think, and they'll meet you there. They'll meet you at that level of detail. And I think people are pretty, they connect, like you're saying, with this sort of fish out of water component and the kind of, unknown narrative of it. And I think it's not that they react, they don't come to me with like a discrepancy in terms of their understanding. And in fact, I guess because this is the nature of sort of interaction, they come with their understanding of things, the things that connected with them. And so I think the narrative that happens around that, about books in general, is really about people's, what they've learned over the course of it. So what they didn't know before that they know now. And so I think, and I couldn't say necessarily that they're wildly different. Although one thing I do hear from people who come from a South Asian background is, they'll say something to the effect of, that felt very true. Like that felt like what it really feels like, and I hadn't necessarily put it that way before. And so that is somewhat different, obviously, from somebody who's not from that background, who says, I didn't know anything about that, but they might actually be talking about the same thing, if that makes any sense. It's just coming at it from different angles,
Yeah, that does make sense. I just adored this book so much. And I think, one of the things that I just loved so much about it is how, I don't know, like everybody kind of gets their opportunity to be deepened and be complex. I said about the story, like this, that you sort of expect what the story is going to be. I feel like that's also very true of each one of the characters. And so many of these characters, many of them actually get their own like whole point of view chapter, which was totally unexpected for me. Even if I was sort of finding myself beginning to connect with that character, I wasn't necessarily expecting them to get like a whole chapter, And I just loved that,
Well, I definitely, thank you. That's obviously very intentional. I think that it's to round out the narrative in a certain way. And I think, one of the things that people should keep in mind, especially if you're talking about the novel form, is that it is capable of comprising any number of techniques and approaches to story, so that you can step outside what you think is the conventional narrative and provide further clarification in a different narrative way. And I think that's what makes it so exciting, is that it can be composed in that way, and that it can, it comprises just different ways of approaching style. And I think, we see some of the things that excite me the most when I read them do that. They experiment with form and with the approach to narrative storytelling. So that's very intentional. And I think it also it's about giving voice, giving voice to people who need that. And you're right that if you took out, for example, like the Teddy or Parvati sections, there are really deeply held secrets there that you would not know and the narrative would suffer for it, I think. So I think those are the questions you're kind of posing to yourself over the course of working on something, because you want to be providing a different perspective and rounding out the story that you're trying to put forward to people.
Yeah. So, another thing I was thinking about with this book is, so one aspect of the book, one of the sort of main storylines is, if not exactly a coming out story, it's sort of like in that same sort of universe, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But the character that revolves around is in his, he's a middle-aged character, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which I thought was really interesting because, usually when you read a coming out story, it's a young person. And what was striking me, especially because, two of the characters, Harit and Ranjana, they are sort of in the same sort of stage of life, in that sort of maybe 40s, early 50s kind of stage. And then the third major protagonist is Prashant. He's the young person, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The thing that always strikes me, I love a coming of age story. I'm a real sucker for them. It always strikes me that those stories center around a young person, right? Because that's sort of what we expect. But it also strikes me that we can have similar kinds of transition and sort of blossoming and coming into one's own and coming into self-knowledge, or even sort of like a growth journey at other stages of life. That was something really interesting to me, how you accomplished that in this story,
Yeah, you're absolutely hitting it on the head, which is that it's coming of age, but it's a different age. And you're right. In the character of Harit, it is very explicitly coming out, but it's almost, in many ways I started looking at it more as a coming into, like coming into that part of his identity. And I think you're absolutely right, where, we often center age and youth around youth when it comes to coming out narratives, because that is typically not even when those questions get posed, but increasingly, hopefully in the world, it becomes the more logical time when that happens. But there are plenty of people for whom that doesn't happen. In fact, when Blue Boy came out, because that does center the narrative of a 12-year-old who's coming into his own, who doesn't necessarily come out in that way, but who's coming to know that about himself. A lot of readers that I had who were older really connected deeply with that narrative because they saw something in it, but a lot of them hadn't had that story necessary. They hadn't had the opportunity to come out at a younger age, or to grow up in a world that was theoretically more progressive than the one in which they had been. And so that was an opportunity here to consider those emotions of people who weren't afforded the outlet to be able to be themselves fully, and to pose these questions and then hopefully eventually answer them.
It's interesting hearing you talk about this. That is also something that I love about a coming of age story, is because I was at one point a young person. I'm 40 years old now, so I'm not that old, but I'm not super young anymore either.
I'm 39, so there you go.
But what I love about a coming of age story is that I can remember being that age. And so either in ways that, it sort of echoes what was familiar to me, or presents something different that I could, connect my younger self to, like maybe an alternate version kind of thing, right? That's something that's really fun. But what strikes me about this is that it kind of maybe does the opposite by putting the coming of age story into an older character, that it might, this happens in the book where, Prashant sort of has this opportunity to try and look to, understanding his, these older people. And I feel, and actually, I remember this was something that you had talked about in, some other interviews that you did, or I think maybe in you did a lecture called The Novel Idea.
Yeah, right.
And you talked about that sort of unknowability between generations and sort of trying to imagine across that. The idea of this book doing that in both directions is something that's really kind of exciting to me,
Yeah, it is trying to look at those sort of both parallel and then perpendicular narratives, like in terms of how people self-identify and how they think of themselves. And I think I might have talked about this in that lecture, but one of the pieces with him, the Prashant character, is that in theory, if you were to lay out the various narratives and the various journeys, emotional journeys that people are taking in the book, his is kind of the shortest, and yet it feels as weighty to him as the others feel to the others, if that makes any sense. And I was trying to kind of show that almost emotional relativism in a way of what challenges people think they have versus what other challenges people are going through. And I think, there's that section in which, Hadad thinks of himself on a ladder, this idea of like people being above him on a ladder. And he is afraid of the idea that they don't even realize that he's so far down this ladder they're on, and they're not even looking behind him. They don't realize that he's even there, that he's struggling in a much more difficult way. And so I'm really fascinated by this idea of different emotional bandwidths people have and the challenges they think they face versus ones they may be facing in actuality, and what the moral implications of that might be.
Yeah. I kind of think that question is sort of at the crux of like everything that's happening in the world right now.
Correct. That's right.
Yeah. If we could only find some way for people to have a little bit more perspective. I hope that's what art can do, but at the very least, it's, I don't know if art can change the world. I say this all the time on the show. I don't know if art can change the world, but I am pretty sure it can change a person. So
that's a great way of putting it. That's absolutely right. Yep.
So, another thing that you talked about in that lecture, which was something that I really had to stop and think about for a bit, because, you were talking about people often tell you that you should write what you know, and that what you tend to prefer is that you should be writing towards what you want to know.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it, because as a writer, I think that finding something that you are interested in is certainly something that makes it more exciting and makes, at least even on a project level, makes it more viable. Like if you're not excited about it, then it's hard to keep working on it. I was kind of thinking too, we're talking about, imagining into an experience that is not necessarily congruent to your own, which,
right. Mm-hmm.
As an act of empathy, I think is really, a valuable one. And it's one that I kind of wish more people just in general, even outside the context of art, could do. But in the context of art, because we also have these conversations about things like appropriation and, and it seems like a little bit kind of tricky to tease out sort of, the word you used just a second ago is moral responsibility, and sort of trying to find that balance between, imagining across and extending that empathy and in order to write outside of your experience, but also, doing it in a way that is morally responsible. Like, how to figure that out seems like it could be kind of tricky,
It's a good point you're making, which is that there's a distinction between the questions the author is posing to be able to create the work and the questions the work is posing. You know what I mean? So those are, in theory, there should be a number of questions being answered in the creation of it that are engaging with these very topics you're talking about. And then it's really up to the author to do the due diligence to try to answer those questions. And then, there are these gray areas or ethical areas or moral areas that, hopefully the best of literature is trying to engage with. And in a way, the work then is posing those questions, taking the answers in the research of it, and answering the things it can and posing the questions it can. So I think, you're right. Like, I think increasingly it does fall to the author to do that work and to really put in the work and to try to bridge that gap and do as much as they can, as much research they can and interviewing as they can to create what seems to be a true experience and a respectful one. And then the work, hopefully, for the things the author can't quite answer or the questions it poses or the challenges that are still there, hopefully the author is almost working with the audience to enlighten everyone, that it edifies everybody by even engaging with those issues. Yeah. So it's a difficult line to actually draw between the two, but I do agree with you that I think it increasingly takes more effort on the part of people the more the world gets to know itself than less, because there are more people that you're trying to be respectful of, and the world is a complicated and complex place. And the more you learn about it, the more difficult in a way the writer's job gets. But that's the challenge and the exciting challenge of it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that to me, both in the reading of the book and also hearing you talk about it in other interviews and in that lecture that you gave, is I feel like you can tell the difference between when someone is making a piece of work that is addressing things outside of their experience. You can tell the difference when they're doing that because it's just like, well, it would be boring otherwise, or things like that. And when it is actually because they are trying to, for themselves, like make some kind of an empathetic connection, you know? And I feel like this book does that really well.
Yes, and I agree. You can tell, people, again, like readers are smart people and like they have a high threshold of understanding. And I think that they know when those questions have not been posed or when the work has not been done. And just actually as a point of clarity, just to mention that the event that you're mentioning was a novel idea, which was in Bend, Oregon in 2018. And it was a one city read for the city of Bend, Oregon. It was a really wonderful event that they do every year, but I just wanted to make sure people knew what that was because they were so generous and so welcoming.
I'll put a link in the show notes to the lecture because I watched the whole thing earlier this week and it was really fantastic. So it's definitely worth the listeners taking some time and watching. So another thing that you have talked about this book is the way that Ranjana's writer's journey is sort of this meta commentary on publishing. Which, first of all, I just like the way that she starts out this writing group that she's in. It was just hilarious, because I feel like anybody that's been in a writer's group can kind of recognize those types, right?
Yep.
There's a part towards the end of the book, when she goes to this writer's conference and sees this very famous Indian author give the keynote lecture. And she has this moment of realizing that she'll never be great. And there's this line that I wrote it down, and the line was, she couldn't tell if it was defeating or liberating to realize that she wasn't destined for greatness. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was, that really hit the nail on the head for me. It's something that I think about with my own work from time to time. But also like, it actually made me think of it. By training, I'm an engineer and I went to engineering college and I went to a pretty elite school. And after coming out of high school where I was sort of hot shit, right? That, everybody in that school was hot shit in high school, right? You had this moment where after my first exam, realizing how much I was not on the same level as some of my classmates was kind of devastating, but also one of the most liberating things that I've ever experienced. I don't know if that's something that necessarily everybody has to experience in order to be able to move on with my life. But for me, at least, it was something that, and my realization at that time, and certainly the realization I've had with my creative work later, is very similar to what Ranjana has this realization afterwards. This like, you know what, it's okay if I'm not going to necessarily be the next, the author's name here is Pushpa Sandhi. If I'm not going to be that, I'm not going to be the next Shakespeare or whatever. But just because there's something that you had mentioned as like this whole thing being kind of meta, I was just sort of wondering if that was like, to what extent that sentiment was something that you had found useful in your own writing career.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I think because, everybody knows that the comparison is just, it's inevitable. And as much as you don't want to do it, and as much as you don't want to, as much as you want to be eyes on your own paper, so to speak, it's very difficult to extricate yourself fully from that larger perspective. And I think, one of the things I would note is that oftentimes people, especially writers, will say something to the effect of, I'm done reading about other writers. I don't need to read another book about a writer. I need to see another movie about the creative process, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the other meta commentaries here was, I think that's actually not just unwise, but kind of an unfair take to have, because in this circumstance, for example, you have this middle-aged Indian American woman who's an immigrant who is engaging with her creative work, which happens to be genre fiction of a sort, and she's posing these questions to herself. She's looking at this person who's legitimately famous and trying to situate herself within that. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not a narrative I've really read before, and I think, and if I have, if that narrative has existed in some sense, it's in a very minimal way. And so I think we have to be careful about when you say, I don't read this type of thing, or I don't want to see this type of narrative. Well, there are still narratives within that to be recounted. And the question is, are you saying something different? Are you putting something down that's different, that is shifting that perspective and actually convincing people who might have that limited perspective to give it a different try? And so that is a meta commentary, not just in the quality of work or the story being told, but again, these entrenched ideas people have about what can be written about, what can be included and what can't. And so that at once is hopefully kind of providing that perspective in a variety of ways in one narrative as you're reading it.
Yeah. I mean, at that, reading, I think that probably for me anyway, I probably am, I have read enough narratives about young, straight, white male geniuses who have to find their voice. But, a story about a middle-aged Indian immigrant woman who resolves to, maybe she's never going to be, literary genius, but she can still, do something that's meaningful to her. That's not exactly the same story.
Right, correct. That's exactly it. Exactly.
All right. Well, why don't we take a quick little break and then come back and do the second segment?
Sounds great.
For the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I have to tell you, this is something I feel like I brought this up on a panel or something at some point, but I can't remember if there's legitimate evidence of it. It's so funny because I was listening to past episodes and I'm hearing you now, and we have to talk about ASMR. Because you have such a soothing speaking voice. So I'm like, this is the topic, because I think I avowed this in some event that I was doing, but I listen to it a lot of the times when I'm working and when I'm writing. And so it is a fascinating topic to me because I feel like there have to be a lot of people who are creative who feel the same way. And it is just such a point of endless fascination for me. And it's funny because I remember watching, there was I think it was a video that the New Yorker put together a few years ago about the history of it and kind of the origins of it. And many people point to The Joy of Painting as one of the early examples of ASMR and what really kind of was triggering for people who had it. And it's hilarious to me because I was exactly that person. I used to watch that show all the time when I was growing up. And then when eventually is available on YouTube, I felt the same way about it. But I thought I must be crazy about this because I don't know why I have such a strong reaction to it. And then lo and behold, this whole community of people popped up and it became such a huge cultural shift. But it is such a part of the creative process that I thought it was worth talking about.
Yeah. Well, isn't that just the thing about the internet, is that no matter what it is that you might think I'm the only one that's ever been into this.
That's right.
You can find your people. Yeah. I mean, it's something that, well, first of all, thank you for the compliment.
I'm like, you have start a channel because another channel, because then you can have a whole other revenue stream.
I mean, I really have very little knowledge about ASMR, although I do find the funny thing, probably the closest I get to that world is that my kids often have a hard time falling asleep. And there are all these YouTube channels that are these sort of children's sleep meditations with these sort of they're mostly done by women with these very breathy voices. And they're just, telling a story or whatever. And it does get them right off to sleep for sure.
It is. I mean, it's funny. There was one, I'm not even going to give too much of it away because I feel like it's my thing and I don't want the masses to co-opt it. But there was this one in particular that was a baking video that was it was an obsessive compulsion for me to when I was working, especially on that last book to listen to over and over again. It was like a half-hour long video. Like I knew exactly the rhythms of it. And like if I had like a half hour or maybe an hour of time, then I could listen to it twice, you know. Something about it, like returning to it, was so calming and so encouraging to me. And I do, the funny thing is I actually do like to bake. So I think that factors into it as well. But just something about the whole thing in tandem of it, like the sound of it and then what was being done, et cetera. It just was so activating for me for some reason. So, but there are, of course, a million different versions of what people do and what people are doing when they create those. So it's completely different.
Yeah. Now I know that you are very, a very musical person. Do you think that there might be some aspect to being attuned to sound in that way that plays into this for you?
That's a really good question. I think it probably does because, you know, I think it's funny that you say that because I often liken, like both in the kind of editing and writing process, that, you know, a lot of it is like a musical movement, you know, when you're reading through something or you're composing something, and notice the word compose is relevant in both contexts, that you are creating a certain rhythm and a movement to it. And that's why, like to your earlier point, there can be sections of a book that kind of step outside and do something different and come back, and they're motifs of a sort in a way that you weave into the overall perspective. And so I think, you know, there probably is something to that. And I mean, to be clear, I do listen to a lot of music when I write too. So it's not like the ASMR is the only thing that I listen to, but there probably is some relationship and some parallels to be drawn there.
Yeah. I think that the whole question of like sort of how we enter that creative state is a really interesting one because I mean, I know this is not an uncommon experience, but I just find it terribly difficult to get started at all, right? You know, once I'm down in it, like if I can sort of trick myself into starting and get head down into something, it's not too bad. I can keep going. But like just the getting over the hump into that creative state it's just excruciating sometimes. And I just find it so interesting the ways that so many different artists use things like music or ASMR or whatever it might be to kind of like help ease themselves into that. Because I do kind of feel like that you're in sort of a different mental space and emotional space when you're in the process of making something than you are in the rest of your life. You know, it's sort of all mysterious to me and I don't really.
Well, those just juxtapositions are very good to point out. Actually, one of my favorite examples of that, which is completely in a different context. But I remember years ago learning that when Janet Jackson did the tour for Rhythm Nation 1814, she would listen to Dr. Feelgood by Motley Crue before she went on stage. And I think that probably played into like when she did Black Cat, that song, because that's such a rock driven song. But I always loved that fact. Like there was something, you know, that juxtaposition of genres that she was experimenting with and what she was listening to before she went out and performed that show. So this idea that you're saying sort of that you can do something completely unexpected and maybe not even adjacent to what you're trying to accomplish. And it's the thing that will put you in the headspace to actually get going and actually accomplish something. Yeah. So, you know, and I think artists of all stripes kind of do that they experiment with different media and different ways of kind of activating their creative impulses.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think another thing too is, you know, I wonder right now, because a lot of the things that I hear people talking about, creative people and non-creative people, I don't know how I feel about that term, non-creative people. It sounds kind of condescending.
It sounds quite harsh, actually.
Yeah. But, you know, artists and lay people, let's say.
Yeah.
I feel like there is this sort of draw towards things that are soothing lately. And like people talk a lot about stuff like the Great British Bake Off, which I haven't seen, but everybody talks about how charming and just calming it is. And I feel like, I don't know if this is something that's particular to right now, or if it's something that, you know, maybe this would always have been a thing if it had been come around at an earlier era. But I do feel like right now, we all kind of want to be soothed a little bit, you know?
I think that's absolutely true. I think it is. I mean, I think you see it in a variety of ways too, because, you know, what was it like probably at this point, like 3 or 4 years ago, where self-care became the thing people talked about the most, and I think it factors into that. So I think people finding, not just your kids, but people in general having trouble sleeping is probably because the world is such a terrifying place. Yeah. So they're looking to these things that actually provide some sense of calm and centering them. And I think, books are often that for people too. And I think, the thing I find most powerful about books right now is that they can provide solace, but it almost feels like people are connecting deeply with the books that engage with the difficult things in the world, don't necessarily solve them, but at least acknowledge that they're happening and that there is struggle and that there is challenge there, because that acknowledgement itself, I think, gives people some sense of catharsis, because at least the questions are being posed and people are trying to make sense of it. But I think, you're absolutely right. I think that we're in a kind of unprecedented period in which that's becoming all the more pronounced, and that people are really kind of looking for moments of catharsis and things that provide that catharsis even more than usual.
Yeah. This is sort of a tangent, but there was this really interesting discussion. I want to say it was earlier this year that, maybe late last year, that Rachel Zucker had on her podcast Commonplace. And I don't remember who she was talking to, unfortunately, but it was a person who is very politically active and, makes very politically engaged work, had this sort of skepticism about catharsis, like the idea that you could, by having an artistic catharsis, that could make you just make you feel like you'd done something, when in fact you hadn't. It was reminding me of this study. I think I saw this on some Richard Blais TV show.
Yeah, right.
He was talking about if you put a salad on a menu, that the restaurant will end up selling way more French fries, because just looking at the salad on the menu makes you feel like you made the healthy decision.
Oh my God, that's so fun. That's exactly me. Like in every place where I go, apparently that marketing has worked effectively because I've fallen prey to it.
Yeah. But I mean, I do, like, I don't know, like I really go back and forth on that, because, I do think that we need to be engaged with the world, but also I kind of feel like, man, if we can't have at least some amount of soothing, I don't think we're going to make it.
Yeah, exactly. I know you need to find solace somewhere.
Yeah.
It just seems to be in short supply, so people are seeking it out.
Yeah. But I do think that thing that you said about, people are really engaging with work that is talking about things in ways that I feel like maybe they weren't before. And that is an interesting thing, especially sort of in light of this need that we have to be comforted. I want to see that as hopeful.
I know. Well, I think so. And I think, again, it's worth noting, like, I mean, I'm almost bringing it up kind of pejoratively, but I mean it seriously with the whole ASMR thing, which is that there is a community built around that. There's a reason why they refer to it as the ASMR community. And so, people are linking with each other and finding comfort together, which I think is a sign of the times. It's like, it's a thing that's reflected not just in online communities like that, but then, to kind of get back to the idea of books too, that's why people connect over books, because there's a sense of connection there. And thematically, for the very book that we're talking about, I mean, I think that is the aim of that, is to provide a variety of perspectives and to bring them together and to show connections among people, and people who maybe have unexpected connections that you wouldn't, think to be there. So I think it's all, that sense of communion is very central to what people want, I think, from art right now, and the ways in which they live their lives online.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, I guess I hadn't really thought about this so much, but there is this way in which the character's journey in No One Can Pronounce My Name sort of maybe mirrors what we might want in real life. Like right. Everybody is very isolated and sort of crying out for connection, and then able to find that. The ways that we're able to do that in real life, and by real life, I guess I do include online life. Yeah. Not everybody does. It does seem like an important question. Yeah.
I mean, I think, one of the reasons why you, in fact, have this podcast, I assume, is because people, want to talk through what they're creating, especially during times of turmoil, and what motivates them and what challenges them and what issues they're trying to tackle. And I think, like many people, I think most people who are writers right now are trying to figure out how to write about what's happening in the world right now in a way that feels knowledgeable, but is not hemmed in by the constant, or not even hemmed in, kind of thrown off course by the madness of everything that we're seeing happen on a daily basis. And a lot of that is going to have to do with structure and style and ways in which people test those boundaries, because that will eventually produce the work that feels the most emotionally true, I think. But you're right that there's a kind of thread of connection among all of those things that is even more prominent now.
Yeah. And I do find that, thinking about this is something that you've talked about elsewhere, that being able to use things like humor and things like that are sort of maybe not as expected a way of creating that connection, but can be because it's less expected, can be more effective. Yeah.
It's disarming. That's the thing. And so I think that you're right. It becomes even more effective because of that very quality.
Yeah. You are absolutely right, by the way, that connection is something that's very important to me about this show and sort of how it came about. I mean, it came about because I found that the experience of going to an art festival and talking with other artists was just really fulfilling to me.
Yep.
Yeah. And not something I got to experience a lot otherwise. And it was something that I thought, if this is something meaningful to me, then maybe it might be meaningful to guests that I might talk to, but also the audience, and hopefully it is something that can sort of engender that feeling of community and connection as well. It's certainly my hope anyway.
Well, in practice, it seems to be happening. I would agree. So thank you.
Yeah. So there's one question that I like to end with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I think many people, am completely obsessed with the new FKA Twigs record. I think she's a genius. I think I don't want to reduce any one person to any other one person, but I truly believe she's this generation's Kate Bush. And I love this record. I mean, I think it's emotionally devastating. It's sonically incredibly innovative, I think. And it is, I think people question like, oh, do people make albums anymore? Plenty of people make plenty of albums, and they're really thought of as being that art form. And this is most certainly thought of in that way. So I am a big fan. I'm actually going to go see her live in a week, so I'm very excited about that.
Cool. Well, yeah. First, I just have to say I absolutely love it when people when I ask that question and people can come up with something that's not not in their own art form. I always right. love that. So I love the in art form recommendations as well, but anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. To say nothing of, I'm not disparaging books, obviously. So there you go.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it. I had a great time.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can find links in the show notes to where you can purchase copies of Rakesh's books, No One Can Pronounce My Name and Blue Boy. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode was done by me, and the music is by Poddington Bear. You can find all of the show's social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechanneleopen.com. And if you'd like to support the show, you can make a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia. A $5 monthly pledge gets you access to our bonus audio archive, which includes readings from guests of Keep the Channel Open and interviews with the authors of Likewise Fiction. Coming up next week on Likewise Fiction, I'll be reading Kat Howard's story, A Nest of Ghosts, A House of Birds, a beautiful story about ghosts and family and home that airs on January 6th, and you can find that at likewisefiction.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Keep the Channel Open. We'll be back on January 15th with a conversation with photographic artist Paula Riff, so do be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.